I bet some of you may be wondering, what's the difference between full-time employment and contracting? Well, I'm going to try and answer some of those questions today. Now, the first thing I want to point out is when it comes to finding work within full-time employment, you're pretty much looking at Reed, Indeed, and all these other different places in order to find work. And I'll be quite frank with you, when it comes to contracting, it's pretty much the same thing. When I'm looking for different contracts, I'm looking at those same places as well as places like CV Library, etc., etc. However, there are some specialist areas such as PSR, public sector resourcing within the UK, as well as other sort of spaces such as agencies that may be able to help you as well. Now, of course, agencies can help you out when it comes to full-time employment, and of course, they get a cut in terms of a finder's fee, so to speak, after the calling off period. But it's pretty much the same. So there's no difference in terms of where you find opportunities when it comes to full-time employment and contracting. The second thing is applications and interviews. Now, again, when it comes to full-time employment, it's pretty much going to be CVs, supporting statements, and applications as well. And when I say applications, usually the organization is looking for you to use their sort of system, and you're answering an array of different questions in order to upload it onto their system. Let's say, for example, it's Track, and they can see whether you're the right fit or not. Now, when it comes to contracting, it's pretty much going to be CVs and supporting statements, but mainly CVs. So it's very important to make sure that your CV is on point. And when it comes to writing your CV, that you write things in a project sort of like space, as opposed to all this different experience that you may have. Now, again, there'll be similarities, but you need to be able to tailor it so that they understand that you have that contractual experience. So the main difference is in full-time employment, you may get certain types of applications, whereas with contracting, it's mainly going to be CVs and supporting statements. Now, when it comes to interviews, when it comes to full-time employment, you're most likely going to have a formal interview. Okay, so there may be a stage 1, stage 2, maybe even a stage 3. There may even be a test or some sort of application-based exam in order to assess how good you are. Now, when it comes to contracting, it could be all of those things as well as an informal interview. Okay, so you may have an informal interview or you may have no interview. Now, I've had all of these different scenarios. I've had formal, informal, and no interview whatsoever. And it really just does depend. I mean, if you don't get an interview, that could be seen as a red flag, because it could be seen as the organizational team are very desperate. They don't have time to really check your credentials properly, so to speak. And so you may not like the environment, culturally at least anyway. The next thing is contract length. So when it comes to full-time employment, well, if you're full-time, you could either have a fixed time employment or you could be indefinite, so to speak, or at least until the organization exists. And so really there's no real negotiation outside of that. Whereas if you're a contractor, typically you'll get contracts between 3 to 12 months, probably between 3 to 6 months for most people within the contracting space. But if you get a 12-month contract, that's great. Now, there may be situations where you're in the same organization, you have various different contracts, but you've been there for a long time. So for example, I've been in situations where I've been in one organization for 18 months, but had 4 different contracts. So that is depending on your situation, who you know, your niche expertise, and all of those different things. So when it comes to contract length, it'll be different. Okay. Now you have to remember, when it comes to those lengths as well, in terms of how you get paid, it's going to be slightly different. And because you're on the payroll as a full-time employee, whether you're fixed or not, the compensation is going to be different. I'll talk more about that a little bit later on. The next thing is notice period. Now, for most full-time employees, the notice period is going to be anywhere between 1 to 3 months. But if you're quite senior, then it's probably going to be about 6 months. But to be fair, if you're that senior, you could probably leave whenever you want to leave. And so it's quite fixed. When it comes to contractors, again, it's going to be different. Most contractors have a 0-day notice period. You can actually get that changed. So some contractors may not be aware of this, but you can actually change that into your contract. Now, it makes sense to let your client know, so the person or the organization you're working for. And of course, you'll need to let your umbrella and or limited company, if you're working through one, know that you're looking to change your notice period as well. And again, it's just a change of contractual terms as long as everyone's happy. I've had situations where I've had a notice period for 0 days. I've also had notice periods for 2 weeks. I've also had notice periods for 4 weeks. And some people may say, what's the point if you're a contractor? Well, the benefit to me was that when I was moving house or getting my first home, it made sense to have a sense of security, so to speak, to ensure that if they were to cut me for whatever reason, then I had at least 4 weeks to plan and decide what I needed to do. So those are the differences when it comes to notice period. Next, we also have security. As a full-time employee, there is this sense of security in this whole concept that, because I'm in full-time employment as a permanent member of staff, I'm less likely going to be fired. They can't get rid of me easily, etc., etc. And that in some respects is true. You are bound by, employer law and these different rights. So you are protected in that sense. When it comes to a contract, is different. They have basic rights, so to speak, but they're not protected by the same stuff. Now, there is this whole thing of the conduct regulations of 2003, which really works for those who work inside of IR35. So those who do work that are similar to employees within an organization. And they just basically highlight and stipulate that, based on your agreement, that you work under the same conditions as you would if you were employed directly by that employer. Okay. If you're outside of IR35, so basically work that is more performance based and it could be deemed as flexible by nature, but not typical of an employee working for an employer, then it's going to be slightly different. It doesn't make sense for you to opt into the conduct regulations of 2003. The other thing to say about this is that when it comes to an employee working as a permanent employee, they have sick pay, they have holiday pay, and so they have that sense of security, so to speak. Whereas a contractor, you have to be your own finance manager, you have to be responsible, you have to have that entrepreneurial spirit, so to speak. And so it pays to be professional and sensible as a contractor, or what I like to call an independent consultant. Now, if you're looking to become a contractor and you found finding the information elusive or difficult to understand, or you're not really getting what you want to get, well, I created a course called The Independent Consultant, a guide to becoming a contractor within the UK. And the reason I did this is because I did a video on my journey to contracting. It got a little bit of attention and lots of people have been asking me questions on LinkedIn, YouTube, Instagram, in person. And I thought, why not just really put all my experience and knowledge into one space? And it's not just my experience and knowledge. This has come from other people as well. This has come from what DirectGov says as well, and all these different places. It's all packaged and housed in an easy step-by-step guide that can take you from A to Z. And the benefits, of course, include, number one, a sense of diversity in terms of the different types of people you're working with. Number two, that sense of flexibility and being in control of your destiny. Number three, compensation is improved drastically. And again, there are so many things that you could benefit from based on taking this course. So if this is something that you're interested in and you want to remove all this mystery around becoming a contractor, then make sure you click the link below, check out the details, and make sure you get the course in order to start your journey today. The next thing I'm going to say is about diversity of work, as I stated before. So as a full-time employee, it depends what you're doing, okay? I can't say there isn't a sense of diversity. There's always going to be a sense of diversity. But again, that's dependent upon the role. Whereas a contractor, if you're doing 3 months, 6 months, X months, and you're doing a transformation or a change management program, or you're migrating something, you're starting something up, you're going to meet a plethora of different types of people. When I've done contracting within the public sector, I was lucky enough to work amongst some really intelligent people, especially at the height of the pandemic. These were people who had a great work ethic and had a certain caliber and skill to them, which is something that was admirable to see. Now, again, as a permanent employee, you may not necessarily get that all the time, and it depends how you're built as a person and how you're conditioned. I would say as a permanent employee, there is a luxury of the fact that you have certain employer rights or laws that protect you, and therefore you don't necessarily feel like you have to impress the same way. Okay, now, of course, if you're built that way, it's different. It doesn't apply to you. Sometimes people are just born entrepreneurial by spirit. But it's a different space altogether. The next thing is experience. Now, of course, with any role, you need experience. I mean, it makes sense. The experience that you have is the trust that the organization forms, on you, because that's what allows them to decide whether you should work for them or not. Now, the only thing I'd say about this is that there is a higher sort of like caliber when it comes to choosing people who are going to do contracting roles or works for a client or an organization. And what I mean by this is because you are paying a lot of money for this one individual to do X works, you want to make sure that you get the best of the best. You want to make sure that they have the right experience, that they have the right character, that maybe they know the system, or they know certain people, or they have the right qualifications. These are all things that you want to make sure that they definitely have. Now, of course, you want to make sure this is the case for full-time employees as well, because they're going to be staying in your space for a much longer period, but the pressure feels a bit different when you're a contractor. So it's very minute. It may not necessarily be different, but it can be recognized in some organizations. The next thing is the type of work. So as a full-time employee or part-time employee, there is more likely going to be an operational rhythm to it. Okay. So if you think about how a program usually works, you have the program team that has projects and they're dealing with different transformations. And then you have the business change team, which is usually the operational team. And they're very much closer to the service users or the people using the system. And on the service level, the user level, there is a BAU sort of feel to it. What I mean by that is a business as usual aspect to the operations. It may be rhythmic. It may be something they're used to. There may be policy set against it. There may be service specifications that they're following. As a contractor, of course, you may be involved in some of this stuff. You may be doing some of this stuff, but you're more likely going to be doing a lot of the transformational work, a lot of the change work, a lot of the setting things up, a lot of the migrations. So a lot of drastic change is surrounded around contractors that they're brought in to do a lot of the initial heavy lifting or the stuff that people don't want to do or don't have the time to do or potential resource to do at the time. Because of course, there's a whole pool of contractors out there and they can just be called very quickly to do a piece of work for the next 3 to 6 months, where recruitment may take, again, the same amount of time, 3 to 6 months to bring someone in based on process, protocols, policies, etc., etc. And so it's just a different thing altogether. And so the nature of work and type of work is going to be different if you are a contractor. The next thing is flexibility. Now, of course, this really does depend on the culture and the space and the leaders within your organization as an employee, but the flexibility will feel a bit different, okay? And what I mean by this is, as a contractor, you are trusted and you should be mature enough to take your own leave or do certain works at certain times. Now, that isn't always the case, okay? There are loads of contracts that definitely feel like a 9 to 5. And, if you think about it like this, when it comes to contracting, there are two main types of tax. There's the inside IR35, which basically recognizes a contractor as somebody who potentially could be seen as somebody who could be doing works as an employee for that organization. And there's also outside IR35, a contractor or an individual doing works that could be seen to be doing works that is not recognizable by the organization. Okay. So when it comes to the inside type of person, they're more likely going to have a similar experience to the employee in terms of that sense of flexibility. But of course, again, when it comes to holiday and stuff, it's down to you, really. It's really down to you. I mean, in terms of how you get paid, you're submitting a timesheet as well. Okay. But again, it's dependent upon somebody who works for that organization to sign your timesheet as well. If you're outside, again, it can be a gray area, but it really shouldn't be in the eyes of the law or the eyes of HMRC, should I say. You could be doing performance-based stuff, and therefore you do the works when it makes sense, okay? Now, you'll hear a lot of contractors say, I prefer to be outside, and that's usually because the tax is different, and you're more likely going to get more bang for your buck if you're working outside because of how the calculations are made. Which leads me on to my next point around tax and expenses. Now, as an employee, and again, I'm not a finance person, so you can talk to a finance person or check online to get the real sort of expenses around this. But as an employee, there are so many different tax and expenses that are happening. So there's national insurance contributions, there's your pension. You may even have a SIP as well if that's a personal thing that you're doing. So self-invested private pension. And I would sort of advocate whether you're a contractor not to get that. There's also income tax. There may be apprenticeship levy. And again, there are all these other things such as benefits that you may get, such as the gym or medical care or whatever it may be, that comes out of your gross pay. Of course, your employer makes contributions towards national insurance contributions and pension as well. Now, as a contractor, if you're working inside of IR35, then the contributions are going to be very similar. The only difference is that there may be a salary sacrifice, which is basically where, you get paid less in order to make more in the long run. There also is payment towards agencies if you're using an agent, as well as payment towards your umbrella. I think it's roughly about 12 to 18 pounds a week on average. But again, each umbrella organization is slightly different. Always make sure that you get an FCSA approved umbrella to ensure that you have an organization that is doing it properly and has been accredited as well. If you're outside of IR35, then the tax is going to be different. Okay, so you're going to be paying for an accountant to manage your money and your finances, so to speak, but ultimately you are responsible. There are going to be business expenses. There are going to be things like business insurance that you need to pay for that covers you for professional indemnity and all these different things. You'll still pay income tax and you'll also pay corporation tax as well. But again, it may not be as heavy in terms of the initial deductions that an employee will get or somebody inside of IR35. And of course, the accountant will manage this, and these payments need to be put aside so that the big payment can be made for the tax year as well. There is also compensation. So again, as an employee, you are going to get a gross annual salary and you're most likely going to get paid on a monthly basis. Whereas a contractor, you could get paid a day rate, an hourly rate. If you're working outside, it could be either those two, or it could be performance based on, what you've delivered. Okay. So you could get paid quarterly or literally based on when you've delivered the piece of works that you've promised. So it's a different lifestyle altogether. Now you can see that inside IR35 style type of contractors kind of get best of both worlds. They have a sense of security in terms of rhythm and payment and all of that stuff. But at the same time, because of the lack of laws and the low rights that they have and the way they get paid and the notice period, it isn't as secure, so to speak, depending on how you see security. Now I'm curious to know, based on everything I've just said, if you're an employee, would you consider going contracting? Is it something that you've been looking to do? Again, as I've highlighted before, I've created a course called the Independent Consultant UK, a guide for contracting within the UK. And if this is something you are interested in, if you want to remove all the elusiveness around contracting, if you want to stop going on different websites and trying to go down the rabbit hole to understand this stuff, then make sure you click on the link below to try to understand more and get this course so you can get started on your journey. If you want to see more videos like this, again, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And as always, my friends, understand, reach, and expand. Peace.